The CNBC app. Global market news in one place. Customizable sections and personalized alerts. Stocks tracking, interactive charts and market insights all in your hands. Stay connected. Stay informed. Download the CNBC app today.
A very warm welcome to Squawk Europe. I'm Steve Sedgwick with Karen Cho and Ben Boulos, and these are your headlines. French Finance Minister Roland Lescure tells CNBC in an exclusive interview that France is willing to support the US in securing the Strait of Hormuz, but not until the conflict de-escalates.
We've done it before, we know how to do it. But you don't do that in a war situation. You do that in a pacified situation in which people need to be secularized, people need to be safe.
Chancellor Rachel Reeves warns the UK faces the prospect of higher inflation and borrowing costs due to the Iran war, but tells CNBC the country is in a stronger position today thanks to her fiscal reforms.
It is clear what the source of the shock here, and it is not anything to do with what we have done here at home, but we are in a stronger position to withstand those shocks than we would have been 18 months ago when we had a higher deficit.
Iran targets Tel Aviv with a series of missile attacks in retaliation for the killing of its top security chief, Ali Larijani, while stateside one of Donald Trump's top counter-terrorism officials resigns over the decision to go to war.
A warm welcome to the show. French Economy Minister Roland Lescure has told CNBC the G7 is not yet ready to release more oil reserves as crude prices continue to hover around $100 a barrel. Brent currently trading 101.77. Well, speaking to our very own Charlotte, Lescure added that G7 countries needed to keep ammunition for other potential oil market shocks.
What I can tell you so far is that a couple of weeks ago there was probably 3 scenarios, one of which would probably be similar to what happened in June last year, short conflict, intense, but short-lived, and this scenario is probably gone. Now we're kind of juggling between 2 other scenarios, one in which, yes, the conflict is prolonged and is affecting all of us, and it takes time to slow down, pacify, hopefully find solutions of getting out of it, but at least we're getting out of it, and another one that's more dire.
And so in terms of the impact on oil prices, I know you chaired that G7 meeting last week, and then there was a decision with the IEA to release some of the strategic reserves of oil that helped calm down oil prices, but they're back up now. So I want to ask you, are there conversations of looking at releasing more stock now? Well,
we're not there yet. First, let me explain why we did that. Because at the end of the day, we know that the only way of liberating the oil market is to have the Strait of Hormuz flow some oil. You can't replace flows by stocks. You know, this is a one-off. I mean, we could do more, we have more. But what we wanted to do is show a signal to the market. And I first met my G7 finance ministers, and then we met the G7 energy minister, and then the heads of state met under the presidency of President Macron, to show a signal that we'd be willing to act to cut short-term speculation. You probably remember last week on Monday in Asia, the market opened with a 20+ rise. And then when we started mentioning that we could look into releasing the strategic reserves, it went down to 80. You cannot do $40 in a day without things that have nothing to do with the reality of the market. So we wanted the reality of the market to take stock and to make sure that the short-term speculation that increases the volatility of oil price and that at the end of the day increases the volatility for our citizens at the pump was eradicated. And I think we've managed that. As you said, it's gone down, it's gone up again, but it's less volatile than it was 10 days ago.
And yet we hear more and more voices in financial markets that see a barrel between $150 to $200. Again, is that a scenario that you are preparing for, that you seem likely?
I worked on the market for 20 years, and I've learned one thing: never predict the oil price. We know the parameters of the supply and demand of the oil price. We know that at the moment Asia is lacking oil because 20% of the oil globally has gone, and that oil was mostly going to Asia. So they're finding ways of replacing oil with coal sometimes and others. We don't miss oil. We don't have a lack of oil in Europe. There's no lack of oil in North America. But the pressure that it's put has brought oil around $100 a barrel.
Yeah.
I think for the oil price to go further, we need to be in a dire scenario, a scenario in which, I think we turn to something more systemic, probably more global in a way or another. So we'll see. But at the end of the day, what we need to make sure is that we get ready for all these scenarios, follow them, track them, and make sure we react accordingly. Not too fast, not too strong either, because, we need to keep ammunition for potential other shocks. We need to be in contact with our companies. I have a crisis meeting every morning at 8. We go through the market, we see what's happening, then we talk to all the representatives of different companies, sectors. We exchange with farmers, we exchange with truck drivers. We want to make sure we're in contact to assess as best as we can the impact. But there's one thing I want to say. We're not in 2022. In 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. We had a massive logistical nightmare in Europe. Gas used to flow from Russia. We had to take it elsewhere. There was a massive shortage of electricity. There was a potential shortage of gas and oil. We're not there. Electricity is fine. Gas, we had the spring. We don't have any shortage problem. So the oil is the issue that we have to deal with.
Charlotte, fantastic work. I know it was in the balance. We get this interview right up until the last moment. So really, really great work on getting that as well, and great questions as well. Look, how did you walk away from that feeling? Did you feel reassured that Europe's got a plan, or worried, like you and I have been previously, that Europe's a little bit slow?
Well, as usual, you hear that when there's a will, there's a way, but that way might be a bit slow. We have to wait and see. But certainly it's really interesting to hear from Roland Lescure. Look, his full title is Minister for Economy, Finance, Industry, Energy and Digital Sovereignty. And so, of course, he's a very busy man. And on top of that, of course, France is chairing the G7 this year. And he chaired that meeting with his counterparts of the G7, Roland Lescure, last week. And just after that, the IA released some of these stocks there that can try to help calm the oil market there as well. But of course, all this crisis happening in a particular context here in France. We are just above a year before the all-important presidential election. We're actually between two rounds of election here, the municipal election here in France. And we know the French government is watching very closely the impact this could have on inflation and on prices, given the electoral cycle that is coming up. And we know that under Macron, during the COVID crisis and during the post-Ukraine inflation crisis, the French government was very generous in supporting households and businesses in particular. But of course, now the public finances wouldn't allow that. We know that Roland Lescure became Prime Minister for the economy and finance only in October, after multiple governments fell under the question of cutting the deficit. So, they don't have the same margin that they would have a few years ago here in France. So I asked him whether the French government would consider putting extra protection for the French economy.
Not in 2022. So we shouldn't think the same way as we did then. We were coming out of the COVID crisis, and there was war at the doorsteps of Europe, and gas, electricity and oil were missing in Europe. We had to find it. And it had a massive impact, yes, on oil prices, but on also heating bills, electricity bills. We're not there. Electricity is flowing very freely. We don't have any issue on that. The price of electricity in France is much lower than anywhere else in Europe. Gas, as I said, at the beginning of spring, the weather's nice, thank God. So there's no shortage issue. The price of gas is not really affecting everybody's lives. So we have an issue with gasoline prices. We actually have an issue especially with diesel price, which is only part of what we consume in France. And, we have to make sure that people go through this, which is, in a way, a bit of an external tax that France has to pay, in as fair a way as possible. But as you said, public finance is not what it used to be, and we need to be very clear on the fact that any use of public euro should be well spent, carefully spent, and targeted at people who need it the most.
And yet one thing that we hear from US government voices is that this energy shock will impact Europe more than the US economy, and that's why Europe should help intervene in the Strait of Hormuz. What do you make of this statement?
I mean, the president has been very clear. We are willing to do something to free the Strait of Hormuz, provided that this is not a war situation anymore. Nobody wants to go across the Strait of Hormuz if there's a risk of missiles or drones going on your head. And, the president's been very clear, my president. We need to pacify the region in one another. We need to calm down. We need the conflict to de-escalate. And then we can imagine securing the Strait of Hormuz, as we've already done with the Spaniards, the Italians, the Greeks, in the Red Sea. So we've done it before. We know how to do it. But you don't do that in a war situation. You do that in a pacified situation in which people need to be securized, people need to be safe. Insurance companies need to insure again. We're not there yet. So this is a different situation. Is the conflict going to impact Europe? Yes. Is the conflict going to impact the US? I think yes, too. And, the last time I checked, I didn't start the conflict.
Understand Scott Bessent was in Paris this weekend. How are your conversations with him in particular, particularly the question of the sanctions being lifted, they said, temporarily on Russian oil? We know President Macron has been very critical of that. So how are your talks with your US counterpart on all this potential economic impact?
The G7 was created 51 years ago, exactly for that reason. In difficult times, we need to talk. We need to be in contact, and we need to talk all together, which we did last week for one thing we had in common, which is, shall we release strategic reserves or not, which we did. We also talk about things we don't agree upon, and you mentioned it. Russian sanction is one of the subjects we don't agree upon, because we feel that there's no way Russia should be the beneficiary of this conflict whatsoever. So we said that to each other. He kind of reassured me on the fact that he was, at this stage at least, very concerned, very concentrated on ships that are already at sea. So we'll see, we'll follow that. But on this, we certainly don't agree.
In difficult times, we need to talk. That was his message from Roland Lescure there. He said he's met Scott Bessent, his US counterpart, over the weekend. And, maybe he's the right man to talk to his US counterpart, because he was for a while MP for French citizens living in North America. So, he was very much connected to that region. So maybe he's the right man to bridge there across the Atlantic. But certainly he will be chairing a G7 economy ministers meeting in May. And so it'll be interesting to watch this one very closely. But of course, to bring it back to the French context, you remember the Gilets jaunes crisis. It started with a fuel price crisis. Prices were rising because of your new taxes. That's what triggered some problems. So here again, we are entering an electoral cycle, and they are worried of seeing inflation when the purchasing power is very much the top concern of French voters every time we see a poll nationally. So, they're very closely watching the impact of high oil prices that this could have here on the public opinion. And of course, he said he's meeting with farmers, with truck drivers, because they don't want to see some pocket of discontent start to grow here in the country. Guys.
Charlotte, thank you so much for bringing us that wide-ranging interview. I'm just going to pick up where that interview started, and that was around the Strait of Hormuz, because markets, again, watching it very closely, the lack of support for escorting ships through that choke point. And yesterday we saw the reality of the high oil price. But interestingly enough, it did not destroy the equity market direction on Wall Street yesterday. So we had a pop, as you can see, right across the board. The energy sector was clearly the leading sector, but you also saw consumer discretionary pick up, and some of the big movers there were actual travel stocks, so the likes of Booking.com, Expedia, and we had some strong revenue forecasts for airlines like Delta and American. So those were moving the needle on some of those consumer plays stateside in the travel leisure space as well. So the reality is we bounced, and you can see 0.5% on the NASDAQ. Picking up across on the Asian markets today, this is the state of play. You've got Japanese stocks, very strong moves, more than 2% in the green. And again, on the South Korean market, this is again a hint of some of the FOMO underlying the market, that many are still hoping that this is a Liberation Day concept where you've got extreme selling only to regroup and capture higher territory. So the market, as you can see, poised to leap in some of these areas of the Asian markets. The European futures, this is the picture this morning as we look to get going. Yesterday we wrapped up another positive session, a second positive session in a row. We are also called high, and that is a decent range on the Stoxx 50 futures here in Europe this morning.
Plenty more to come on the show, including this. President Trump again hits out at NATO over its response to the war in the Middle East. Plus, UK Chancellor Rachel Reeves says her policies have made the UK better prepared to respond to market instability. And the CEO of the world's largest sovereign wealth fund sounds a positive note on the market outlook. We'll bring you the highlights from our conversation with MBIM boss Nikolai Tangen later this hour.
I'm Steve Sedgwick from CNBC, and in my new podcast, Executive Decisions, I ask powerful leaders about their decisions that changed everything.
I'm not frightened of making tough decisions, and I think leadership can be very lonely.
Business leaders should not stay quiet in a world which is super complex.
It is absolutely fine to also change your mind.
Tough calls, personal crossroads. These are the stories that we can all learn from. It's Executive Decisions from CNBC. Get it wherever you get your podcasts.
President Trump has again hit out at NATO allies for not getting involved with the war in Iran, while simultaneously claiming that Washington does not, quote, need or desire their help. The US leader said it is a foolish mistake for countries not to support the campaign in Iran, adding it is pretty shocking. Trump has previously called for allies to assist in securing the Strait of Hormuz, which has been met with skepticism by leaders. The US president was asked if he is rethinking Washington's relationship with NATO, including the possibility of getting out of the alliance.
I'm disappointed in NATO that we spend trillions of dollars on NATO. Think of it, trillions over the years, many trillions of dollars. It's one of the reasons we have deficits and we help other countries. And when they don't help us, I mean, it's certainly something that we should think about.
The US National Counter-Terrorism Center Director Joe Kent has announced his resignation in response to the Iran war, saying he could not, quote, in good conscience support the conflict. In his resignation letter, Kent said Iran posed no imminent threat to the US, pointing to pressure from Israel as the reason the war started. Iran has launched a series of strikes targeting Israel and US assets across the Middle East in response to the killing of Security Chief Ali Larijani. 2 people have been killed near Tel Aviv, according to Israeli emergency responders, with explosions reported across several Gulf states. Dan joins us now for more on this. Dan, the significance of this can't really be overstated. Ali Larijani, the second most senior figure from the Iranian regime after Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
That's exactly right, Ben, and it helps to explain why we have seen such a strong response from the Iranians this morning across the Gulf. Iran is clearly striking back here after Israel confirmed the killing of 2 of the Islamic Republic's most powerful officials in a single day. As you say, Ali Larijani was the head of Iran's Supreme National Security Council. He was one of the most senior figures in the country since the death of the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei, and officials inside Iran have now confirmed his death. So it helps to explain why we have seen Tehran retaliating across the Gulf. As I mentioned, fresh Iranian strikes hitting Israeli cities overnight, with 2 people reported killed in Tel Aviv. The conflict also spiraling across the Gulf as well. The UAE issuing multiple emergency alerts this morning as we saw air defense systems here intercepting Iranian missiles and drones. And authorities here in Dubai also saying that booms heard across the city earlier this morning were the result of what they're calling successful interceptions. And as a matter of fact, only in the last hour, we heard 2 very loud booms where we are in downtown Dubai. Perhaps that was the UAE officials intercepting those Iranian missiles and drones. And of course, it's not just the UAE as well. We have also seen Saudi Arabia, Bahrain and Kuwait as well, also being targeted in the last 12 hours as well. And that means that Iran has now struck every Gulf state since the war began. Of course, we're also keeping a close watch on what all of this means for markets and the risk premium in oil. we're watching what's happening with energy and shipping very closely in particular. Of course, President Trump really pressuring NATO allies to join in on his Hormuz coalition to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, also warning countries that refuse that they are making, in his words, a very foolish mistake. But of course, the president has also changed his tone in the last couple of hours, also suggesting that perhaps those NATO allies would not be needed to reopen the strait as well. Interestingly, though, the White House chief economic advisor also telling CNBC overnight that we are starting to see some tankers moving through the strait. It perhaps helps to explain why we have also seen oil prices coming off their highs of the session as well.
Great work, Dan. Thank you very much indeed for that. Let's get to Dan Tannenbaum, who is partner Oliver Wyman and senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Dan, it's strangely addictive reading about what the administration is doing, isn't doing, does do next, looking at Hegseth press conferences. It's just extraordinary turn of events. But the one thing that a lot of smart people on both sides of the House and the aisle politically in the States are looking for is the off-ramp. Is there any way that you're seeing the beginnings of an off-ramp?
I mean, if there's one thing that Donald Trump is good at, it's declaring victory and attempting to get people to change the subject because of his short attention span. So is it possible? Certainly, but we've got 13 American servicemen who've lost their lives for a conflict where the American public still don't understand what we're actually attempting to achieve. Is it securing oil, supply chain, regime change? I do think he's getting to a point now where he's blown past most reasonable off-ramps. And you've got an Iranian regime that's been preparing for this day for nearly 5 decades. So this is not Venezuela where you kill 25 Cuban security officers and kidnap Maduro and his wife. This was never going to be taking out the Ayatollah magically brought down the regime.
So, almost the impossible question. What do you think is going to happen next?
I mean, I do think there will be some sort of ceasefire that's agreed to, whether it's through back channel discussions with the Iranians or otherwise. I mean, this cannot continue, and it would be so deeply unpopular in the U.S. for boots to actually be on the ground in the Middle East again after the president made such a big push to get us out of Middle East wars and being the president of no new wars, which has gone quite the opposite. So I do think there's going to be some degree of negotiated ceasefire. If the underlying objective is regime change, it will fail. This will not work. That is the problem. This is a 47-year-old regime that's had some practice prepping for this moment. But the question is, will that be enough for the president? I mean, even the MAGA base is really against what we're seeing right now because, again, there is no explanation for what we're doing in Iran.
Dan, there's been a lot of comparisons on markers to whether this is Liberation Day again, whether we see that risk off and risk back on. What's different to around the tariff negotiations was that Trump pretty much got his way with a lot of countries. He was very forceful, and ultimately a lot of countries simply just caved to that aggressive negotiation. This time around, a lot of countries are saying no. They've been called on to help in terms of safe passage in the Strait of Hormuz, the conflict itself, and the response has been negative. The first test of in-person conversations will really come this week too at the White House. You've got the Japanese Prime Minister going. The Japanese have a pacifist stance. How do we think about these relationships with international countries that have moved so much in the last 12 months and now almost being reset again?
Yeah, I mean, I think the president learned the hard way this weekend that allies do matter, and antagonizing people that have worked with the United States for generations doesn't end well. I mean, it's been embarrassing for the president to see the reaction from the West of this is your war, you started this, the Pottery Barn role of you break it, you bought it. He's not being backed up by anyone. And I think what he's continued to do, especially with the Russia sanctions relief, is even more deeply unpopular. It kind of adds fuel to the fire of just doing things that are not in line with a multilateral coalition. So I do think what we've seen with the president's call of we don't need help, allies please come help us secure the strait, it really makes him look bad.
If you put together the two events too, from tariffs to wars, you add them up and you get two stagflationary shocks. The American voters have had to weather this as it's good news for them long term. But on both fronts, is there a narrative coming through in domestic press, a narrative that will carry through at the midterms that, look, A lot of these policies have been very negative for the cost of living in the United States for the average voter.
I mean, the midterm at this rate are years away from now. Even though we're in the middle of March, we're talking about November. I mean, the American voter is noticing higher prices. The whole point of grocery prices, everything else will come down. It hasn't happened. Housing prices have not come down. Mortgage rates have risen again after falling back briefly. So I do think there's a problem for the president as we continue to see pain at the pump. And as we know, and as we've learned post-Liberation Day, it takes time for these price increases to flow through. And obviously, when you increase the price of fuel, everything flows after that. But it does take time to net out. But it will happen. These shocks aren't going away yet.
Dan, taking a step back and looking at sort of lots of the individual developments and how they tie together, I think perhaps underscores, interesting to get your thoughts on this, underscores what a tangle the situation is. We have a situation with the Strait of Hormuz where Western oil supplies are being disrupted, and yet Iranian tankers are being allowed passage through to sell oil that will almost certainly fund their activities against the US and its partners. Russian oil, previously under sanction, is being allowed to be bought. Sanctions have been eased, which almost certainly will help pay for Russia's aggression against Ukraine, against America's NATO allies who are supporting Ukraine through that. How do they detangle that? Because it almost seems intractable.
I'm going to make it worse, actually. Let's go back even further of how we got here. Remember, there was a deal between the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council and Iran under President Obama, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2015. It was trading sanctions relief for Iran from a nuclear weapons program. Iran was complying until Donald Trump blew up that deal in 2018, which expedited Iran's move towards the nuclear weapon, one of the pretenses for this move in the first place. So this is even worse, actually, because Iran was working its way away from a nuclear weapons program until actions were taken in the first Trump term to really blow up a deal that was supposed to bring them back into the world economy. So there's also a trust deficit here as well. If there were alliances, if there were deals that were essentially blown up, it's really hard to detangle this. But I mean, it is ironic that the president tells Americans they should tolerate price increases because of Iran while giving Russia an extra $150 million a day in oil revenue. It's very hard to kind of square the circle on this entire issue.
Talking about the nuclear issue, I wonder when the dust settles on all this, whenever it comes to a conclusion, whenever it ends, whether Iran decides it doesn't actually need to pursue nuclear because it already has a big red button it can push with the Strait of Hormuz, and the damage it can inflict on the world economy, arguably in an economic sense, just as damaging, just as powerful a deterrent to any future would-be aggressors?
I think that may not be enough. I mean, they've had nuclear ambitions for a while, then they didn't because of the Iran deal, and then they did as an effort of self-preservation. I don't think they're walking away from a nuclear weapons program because, as we learned, not everything was actually obliterated last year during, I forget whatever the bombing campaign they called that sounded like a G.I. Joe story. It is a bit of an issue. So I don't think they're abandoning that, but it is very clear that they have a strategic advantage that they hold the cards on the Strait of Hormuz.
Epic Fury, I think, was that?
No, the Epic Fury was this one. I think it was.
Yeah, this is Operation Epic Fury, yeah.
But similar-ish name.
Similar sort of tone and tenor to it. Dan, thank you very much. Dan Tannenbaum, partner at Oliver Wyman and senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Really good to get your thoughts and analysis there.